I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to pick up where we left off last week. Last week we looked at the idea of parallel distortion and how we could actually make it a kind of active element of our production. What we're actually going to do this time is to look at a more classic kind of version of parallel distortion, not looking at it from a kind of active track ingredient, but by beginning to see how the aggression and fizz of parallel compression can be really useful if you're trying to knit together sounds that have got different tonal characteristics. Now, what I've got within this track is this quite clean acoustic guitar lick, and that's being accompanied by this kind of more aggressive rock bass sound. Now, both of these sort of audio files are from the loop library within Logic, but you'll see that they've got different tonal characteristics. And what I want to do is to find a sound in the middle, which is going to be drums, which is going to be sort of clean like the acoustic guitar, but a little bit with the potential to get a bit fuzzy and sort of messed up like the rock bass. And that's where our parallel distortion treatment is going to come in. Let's just listen to the track as it stands right now without any drums at all. Okay, you can hear that I've got a little bit of delay on the acoustic guitar loop. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually use Logic's drummer instrument to give us a drum mix quite quickly. I'm going to select the drummer instrument here, and I'm going to actually choose the alternative sort of style of drumming, which basically means that I'm going to have access to drummers that drum apparently in an alternative style, as opposed to sort of songwriter kits or electronic ones or rock-based drummers. So having selected the alternative option here, and I'm going to click the Open Library button because we're going to experiment a little bit with what those sounds go on to become. I'm then going to press Create, and Logic will provide us with a region. Now my track starts in bar 2, so I'm going to move it back down to here, but I do want an 8-bar region, so I'm not adjusting its length. That's fine. It feels like there's a little bit of swing in the sort of acoustic and rock bass elements, so I'm going to just introduce a little bit of that here before we go any further as well, just so the drums match that a little bit. And then what we'll do is go looking for a sound. Now this isn't a tutorial about the drummer instrument within Logic, so I'm going to be relatively quick here. You can see this alternative collection of drummers is here, and what I'm going to do is just to experiment with a couple of them until I find sort of what I'm after, I suppose. And what I can do is to go down through different drummers, and by doing that, if I want to, I have a chance to tell Logic that I definitely do want to do that, select a different drummer, and then I have access to different playing styles, if you like. I want a relatively simple style of pattern. I want it to be loud-ish, and I'm then going to experiment with different kick and snare and hi-hat combinations, and we'll just see if we can find something that feels like it fits a little bit with this kind of backing track that I've been working with. That's nice, but it's a little bit too disco. I'm going to come back to Gavin, see what he offers us. Okay, so this kind of a pattern feels like it's working nicely. I'm not really sold on the fills, so I'm going to just back those down a little bit. And also just kind of like to change the kit a little bit too. We won't waste lots of time. I'm going to just try out this retro rock kit. Okay, that feels like it's working quite nicely. So the next thing I'm going to do is to convert this into a MIDI region. So it's sitting here as a drummer region at the moment, allowing me to configure the way that these sounds work. And again, I'm sort of rushing through this a little bit. I've set a little bit of swing. I'm just going to introduce that back in a little bit, which is obviously changed with our different choice of drummer. But otherwise, I'm going to keep these settings the same. But what I'm actually going to do is just to convert this into a MIDI region, which I can do simply by control clicking it. And if you discover that the convert to MIDI region isn't in the most recent set of things that you've done, you'll find it within the convert options here, in which case it'll just be sitting in the list right here. And by doing that, it turns into a MIDI region. Suddenly I've got a kind of drum part as if I'd programmed it directly myself or played it in. Now, what I've also got obviously now is an opportunity to access the main drum kit. And it's from here that what I want to do is to set up my parallel distortion treatment. Now, it's really common, if you look back or if you're interested in the sort of history of record production, you'll find that lots of people engineering drum sessions have found a way to bring what's usually referred to as a kind of trash mic into a drum session. So in addition to the right choice of snare drum mic and kick drum mic and overheads, which are usually designed to capture the best possible sound imaginable, somewhere the engineer will also rig up something which is designed to sound, well, really not very good. That might be an answer phone microphone taken out of an answer phone machine from the 80s, or it might just be something which overloads really easily. It's just got a little bit of character, but it provides some distortion. And even at the recording stage, you'll find that lots of engineers will find a way just to capture something which sounds a bit trashy in order to produce a little bit of extra character. Now, what we can do is to take our absolutely pristine mix, which is sitting here being generated within Logic's drummer instrument, and look to create something similar. What I'm going to do is introduce a brand new auxiliary, and onto this, what I'm going to do is feed a signal through to a parallel distortion unit. Now, Logic's got lots of distortion options available. If I click here and come down to the dedicated distortion folder, we can look at clip distortion, which is the plugin that we looked at in last week's video. But what I might do as well will be to experiment either with phase distortion or with overdrive, or maybe even with a kind of more digital approach to distortion by using a bit crusher. What I can also do is to come into the collection of effects offered by Logic's Stompboxes. Now, these used to only exist within pedalboard, but now with the new Logic update, I've got access to individual Stompboxes, and I could come into the distortion folder and see if we can just find something which is going to provide a little bit of extra drive. I'm particularly interested to see what happens, for instance, if we decide to drive this through the Monster Fuzz plugin. So the moment I have access to this individual channel by itself, what I'm going to do is just solo the distortion itself and just see if we can configure something here which is going to give us a little bit of extra power. Or a lot of extra power, if you like. So let's just see whether or not this is going to be too much. But I think if we back a few of these dials down, we might just find something which feels really good. So tempting to press play with that in the mix, isn't it? But no, I'm going to resist. Okay, so let's take raw down and growl down and go looking for something which is just much less extreme. Now, if I put the drums back in alongside this is going to sound far too much. Obviously not as much if I had press play. I know I'm such a killjoy. But nevertheless, it's going to sound like too much. But remember, because this channel has its own fader, what we can do is to drop the level until we find this kind of trash sound, which feels kind of appropriate. Here it is at full volume. And then what I'm going to do is to drop the level down so we just get a little tickle of it. And also, obviously, let's just experiment with what it sounds like with none of this at all, and then I'll unmute it. The interesting thing is obviously the quieter it is, in a sense, almost the more extreme the settings can be. I'm getting back to a point where I'm pushing these two main sort of distortion parameters much harder because at low level it can kind of take it. Now it is filling in some of the gaps. In last week's video, we looked at the idea of adding a kind of noise gate in to make the effect of the distortion a little bit more staccato and a little bit less driven. That's up to you, whether or not you like this idea of something which is just sort of filling in those gaps. Now let's put this back into context for a moment. I'm going to unsolo this, so we're hearing it back in context. Remember, the whole idea here was to sort of see if we could fill in the gap a little bit between the clean acoustic guitar and the more driven bass. So again, what I'm going to do is to experiment with both the clean drums, and then I'll unmute this parallel distortion channel and we'll hear how it fits into the mix. And it's amazing how little level you need in order to feel the effect of this particular treatment. Now, again, remember what I said, I selected Monster Fuzz almost at random. There are loads of different distortions within Logic which allow you to go experimenting with this. So if this is feeling a little bit too trashy or a little bit too bright or a little bit too overdriven, experiment with something else instead. But there's also one more thing to have a look at. I'm just going to close this treatment down for a moment, and in fact, I'm going to turn this auxiliary off altogether. If I select a drum kit using Drum Kit Designer, I have the option to swap out the actual kit that I've selected for what's called a producer kit instead. Now at the moment, we're using Drum Kit Designer, and I can see that the sound that I'm using is called Retro Rock. And this is effectively a drum kit, one of Logic's many available to me. And I can see at a glance that effectively it's just occupying one track of my Logic production because it's one instrument providing that. But by switching to a producer kit, what I can actually do is to swap out the Retro Rock kit for this Retro Rock Plus kit. Now, every time you switch between a regular kit and a producer kit, it gets this plus on the end. And the plus really amounts to, effectively, this turning into a multi-track drum production. What do I mean? Well, you'll see that the tracks now become a track stack. If I close down the library for a moment, so we've just got a little bit of screen back, what I'm going to do is to open this up, and we'll now see that every single channel of this virtual drum mix is available as a track stack in exactly the same way, I suppose, that kind of Drum Machine Designer does this for electronic kits. So effectively, what I've now got is a full drum mix where every single channel of a virtual drum kit is available to me with its own channel, its own insert points, its own auxiliary sends, its own potential for being sent to or being sort of grouped together with nested track stacks if I suddenly wanted to bring together a couple of sounds and compress them in a different way. In other words, it's almost like having a whole drum mix across a whole mixing desk in front of me. And what's really interesting is that if you scroll down through a track stack like this to actually see what the individual channels amount to, we can see obviously all of the individual kicks with in and out drums from a microphone position, so the kick in and the kick out mics. We've got a snare top and bottom mic. I can go down through all of the individual elements. And then we get to reverbs. There are two rooms, and then a kind of what's referred to as a kind of leak channel. Then we get into percussion, and then we get into some other things as well. And towards the bottom, we find this crunch channel. And effectively, this is Apple having configured this idea of a parallel distortion channel within this drum mix. We've also got pump, which is a parallel compression channel, and we've made a video about parallel compression, so watch that if you want to know more about that. But effectively, this idea that a crunch channel, something that's part of a drum mix, but it's there to provide this additional power and distortion, is a regular part of how you'd set up a multi-track drum session like this. Might be quite interesting to hear how that sounds, just this one channel. Okay, so that's pretty tame actually as it stands. Let's just see what the second distortion sounds like. Okay, that's a bit more like it. Let's hear how it sounds in context. Okay, so within this video, we've looked at lots of ways that we can begin to address the idea of parallel distortion in the context of drums of a different type of production. So here we've got something which is much more kind of singer-songwritery and much more kind of acoustic in flavour, I suppose, much more like a band. And whereas in last week's video, we looked at the idea of parallel distortion in a kind of EDM context, here we're hearing it in a much more traditional capacity. But what we're learning is that actually we like sounds that have got a bit of grit and a little bit of character. So whether that means that we take our regular drum kit, whether that's made in Ultra Beat or in Drum Kit Designer, and what we do is to set up a new auxiliary send and we feed that into our distortion of choice, or whether it means that we swap out that kit for one of these kind of producer plus kits, which give us this full multi-track drum mix, and then we go and experiment with that kind of trash channel as it exists within one of these extended track stacks. Clearly, the idea of parallel distortion and the tone change that provides is something that's a really essential flavour within a whole range of different productions.